This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com. And this is episode 501 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thank you for tuning in. Hey, baseball fans, FanDuel has a fun promotion going on called $5 Dinger Tuesdays. All you have to do is place a $25 or more bet on the to hit a home run prop on any Tuesday MLB game. You'll receive a $5 site credit that maxes at $25 for each home run hit in that game by either team, regardless if your bet wins or loses. So head over to FanDuel each Tuesday to play the $5 Dinger. Must be 21 years or older and present in Colorado, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. Refund issued as non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 7 days. Max refund $25. Terms apply. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-522-4700 in Colorado, 1-800-BETS-OFF-FF in Iowa, 1-800-9-WITH-IT in Indiana, 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan, 1-800-GAMBLER in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Virginia, Tennessee Redline 1-800-889-9789, or visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net in West Virginia. That's a lot of words. Let's get to these questions. First question this week is from @the_boogie_bot. Is Gurley done? Or should we rethink the hard line that we've drawn for him? I think it's very unlikely that Todd Gurley becomes some fantasy relevant asset in 2021. When you're in the position that he was in last year, and then you lose touches to Ito Smith, it's hard to sell that as anything but very bad. And then to top it off, he's still a free agent. The thing with questions like this is that anything's possible. Like, sure, I guess we could see Todd Gurley find the right home and do something in fantasy. But we can make that argument for other players as well. He's just now lumped into that group. He's in that group of players where you really can't bank on them providing any sort of value for your fantasy team because it's not logical to do that. It's not logical to think that Todd Gurley is going to be worthwhile this year. I don't want to say he's done because he's not retired. But the chance that he's a worthwhile fantasy asset, that's slim. The next question is from @_thegamescript. Hey JJ, congrats on 500 episodes. Thanks. As all hype trains continue for rookies and stud running back rookies from last year, who are a few sleeper year 2 running backs that can catapult into the RB2 conversation? Eno Benjamin, McFarland, Vaughn, Pirine, DJ Dallas, Hasty? So it's really not easy to find sleeper year 2 running backs. Most running backs who are truly good in the NFL and in fantasy, they did something during their rookie seasons. That's what I talked through last offseason on an episode called Bailing on Unproductive Rookies. So the answer to this question is, if the rookie running back wasn't productive last year, chances are he's not going to be very good in fantasy moving forward. And honestly, I think of the players that you just mentioned in this question, the only way they find the field consistently is with an injury. McFarland might be the one who sticks out to me the most, just because there's nothing good ahead of him on the Steelers' depth chart, and maybe Pittsburgh surprises all of us and they don't get one of the big 3 backs in the draft. I think they will, but maybe they don't. That would make McFarland an interesting piece. But I don't think actively buying into any of these guys is a very good bet to make. You're better off throwing darts at this year's rookie class. This next question is from @RyanCharles437. Are you holding out hope for any 2019 rookie busts? Harry, Isabella, Hill, Hurd, Boykin, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, Campbell, etc. Now, I'm still cool with Paris Campbell, but that's about it of this group. At least with Campbell, you can make the injury excuse. The other guys have just underperformed, which is a sign that they just aren't very good. They don't have the production for a reason. But Campbell was off to a decent start last year in his limited action before he got hurt. And Edwin Porras mentioned that he's not all that worried about Campbell on episode 490. That episode was on injury proneness. I just don't think that he belongs with the other busts from that class, at least not yet. This next question is from @StarChucker. Is Javonte Williams just a first and second down running back in the NFL? Seems like a lower ceiling. If a running back is projected to just be an early down back, then yeah, that's a far lower ceiling. But that's not the case for Javonte Williams. He's a do-it-all back. A lot of people are looking at Michael Carter as a satellite back at the next level, and that's totally fine. That's reasonable. But Javonte Williams had the same number of receptions in that North Carolina offense last season. He's not Travis Etienne as a receiver, but he's more than capable of being a 3-down back. If you don't believe that he can be, then yeah, you should bump him down a whole lot. You need that receiving component to be a competent running back in fantasy football. But I don't think it's that big of a question mark given his overall profile. Now, speaking of Michael Carter, this next one is from @InsideSaints, and it says, will Michael Carter be drafted as a workhorse back or only a satellite back? So I think it's likely that he's just going to be a satellite back. The higher end comp that I have for Michael Carter is actually another North Carolina running back, and that's Giovanni Bernard, where there may be games here and there where Carter steps in, he sees a bigger workload, but he's mostly going to be that pass catcher in the backfield. The size really just is not there. And this is kind of an aside, but here's the thing with the size argument at running back. I've found, and I've said this plenty of times in this podcast, but I've found that BMI matters for running backs way more than it does at wide receiver. And for the record, Michael Carter's BMI is fine, he's just a smaller back. Whether or not a smaller built running back can or can't handle a big workload isn't really what that's determining. By me saying BMI matters at running back, I'm not saying it's because smaller backs can't handle big workloads. I don't know the answer to that. It's just based on what's happened historically. There could very easily be coaching biases at play here, where coaches just don't like throwing small backs on the field touch after touch after touch. It may not actually have to do with ability, but what we're trying to solve here is a fantasy football problem. We're trying to maximize the amount of fantasy points that we can get from our running backs. And coaching decisions drive volume at the running back position. So Carter's smaller frame does matter as a result. This next question is from @FutBumbles. Hey JJ, love the show. Is there a material difference in how you'll view the Patriots pass catchers if they draft a quarterback versus if they stick with Cam for the whole season? I say stick with Cam for the whole season because I assume Cam will at least begin as the starter regardless. Yeah, I mean, hypothetically, their offense could change drastically based on the quarterback that they get. Mac Jones is nothing like Cam Newton. So their pass to rush ratio, that might change. The way touchdowns get divided close to the goal line, that changes. A lot can change. There would be some trickle down that impacts every skill player on that team if it's Mac Jones versus Cam Newton. Now, would it mean that I'm all of a sudden buying New England pass catchers? No. I'm just noting that there could be a material difference depending on the quarterback, since New England is on one side of the spectrum offensively right now. They're a very run-heavy offense. If that changes, that impacts everyone. And it can impact everyone in a decently sized way. This next question says, are you worried about J.K. Dobbins' upside considering Lamar Jackson doesn't dump off the ball often and can steal some goal line and red zone carries? Yes, I've been worried about this for a while now. Now, I've got a ton of Dobbins in Dynasty. This is partially a diversification thing. But I just want to let you guys know I've traded away J.K. Dobbins this offseason. Just look at what's happened over the last 2 years with Lamar Jackson as the full-time starter for Baltimore. Baltimore's average of 15.4% target share per season to their running backs. That's the fourth lowest mark in the league. But because it's such a run-heavy scheme, only Tennessee has seen fewer targets go to their running backs over this time frame. Tennessee has 121 running back targets over the last 2 years. Baltimore's at 126. And for the record, this is based on positional eligibility, not where players lined up on the field. So if J.K. Dobbins saw a target when he was lined up out wide, that's being credited here. That's a running back target. Now, obviously, Derrick Henry is a monster piece for fantasy football, and he's on the team that doesn't target their running backs, or hasn't over the last 2 years. But Derrick Henry is also sort of an outlier from a fantasy perspective, given that receiving profile. The way Derrick Henry scores fantasy points is not normal whatsoever. I don't think Dobbins is that kind of running back, where he can get away with carrying the ball well over 300 times per season. Now, the touchdown upside might be there. He might have a spike season, J.K. Dobbins might, where he has 15 touchdowns. But it's highly unlikely he's able to, number one, do that consistently, and then number two, get close to the type of volume a Derrick Henry type running back sees. And again, I'm bringing up Henry because it's really the only player among the teams who don't throw to their running backs. He's the only player who's been able to thrive. There's tons and tons of data that shows us that high-end running backs need that receiving production to be a high-end running back. But Derrick Henry's an alien on a football field. And this isn't to say that there's no fluctuation in data like this. There is. The Rams, for example, they've been towards the bottom of the league in running back target share over the last couple of seasons. But they weren't there when Sean McVay first arrived. It's just how things fluctuate and change based on scheme and personnel. The problem is, I don't think Baltimore's scheme is going to change dramatically as long as Lamar Jackson is quarterback. And I'm looking at that more at a high level. They're never going to be this like pass heavy team with Lamar Jackson. Or I don't think it's at least easy to project that right now. Now, what that means is that in order for Dobbins to see a true difference-making season as a receiver, he's going to have to see a much, much higher target share. And while that can happen, I'm hesitant to bank on that given the fact that Baltimore hasn't even had good pass catchers around Lamar Jackson since he's become starter. What happens if they get a receiver in the NFL draft who ends up hitting? That could limit the ceiling a bit in that backfield. In my eyes, it's going to take a legitimate conscious effort for the Ravens to target their running backs at a higher rate, to target them more. Maybe it happens, and if it does, then Dobbins skyrockets. But I think you can make a similar argument for other players. And when you weigh the odds of it happening, given his price, I can then make the argument that Dobbins is more of a sell than a buy. I think he's more of a hold, though, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that this situation really isn't ideal for fantasy purposes. The nice part about Dobbins, though, is that he's likely going to be efficient. And he's a really, really good running back. This has nothing to do with talent. So despite the lack of pass catching given the offense that he's in, Dobbins can and should still be a solid higher-end RB2 piece in fantasy football in the short term. There's nothing wrong with that. I just don't know if we'll see him ascend to that truly elite tier. This next question is also about the Ravens. It's from @BestBallUKNFL. Is it reasonable to think of 2020 as the floor for the Ravens passing game and 2019 as the ceiling? I wouldn't say last season was the floor, no. I mean, it all depends on expectation and how you define floor. But the Ravens passing offense was still pretty good when you give it context last season. Like, just look at straight up passing touchdowns. Regression from 2019 to 2020, that was inevitable. That was going to happen. In 2019, Baltimore was first in the league by far in touchdown rate, which is just touchdowns divided by pass attempts. As a team, they had an 8.4% touchdown rate. Lamar Jackson's rate was 9%. That's why he won MVP. Touchdown rates were higher in 2020 in total. But Baltimore, even with that context, they still ranked 7th in the NFL in touchdown rate. So even though the passing touchdowns dropped from 2019, they actually threw for a good number of passing touchdowns given the number of passes that they threw. So even just by that simple statistic, I don't think it's reasonable to call 2020 their floor. It can get worse than 2020. I think what they did in 2020 is more in line and closer to expectation in the short term. But I don't think expectation equals floor. Expectation to me is the median. This next question is from @GrantLincoln. Are the top tier of running backs older / do they have more questions than usual this year? So Najee Harris is an older prospect, yes. And I think the majority of prospects have some sort of red flag. But I think this question might just stem from a comparison to last year's class, which was objectively better. Last year's running back class was great. This class is not very good in total, but the guys at the top are pretty good. I think this class comps better to the 2019 class than the 2021. And I would argue that that class had more red flags at the top. And I would say that the top of this class, so Najee Harris, Javonte Williams, and Travis Etienne, they look better than what we saw in 2019. So I don't think there are more question marks this year for the big three. I think it's just easy to compare them to last year, which had a lot of great running backs. This last question is from @TSteppen. Noticed an uptick of #0 wide receiver content lately and would be interested in your take. It appears to ignore fantasy roster turnover through the season and is focused on having the best roster out of the draft. Feels overconfident to assume it's easy to hit on later wide receivers consistently. Yeah, so I did a study last summer on where league-winning players come from in fantasy football. There are plenty of ways to define what a league winner is. But I just looked at players who finished in the top 8 at wide receiver and the top 10 at running back. Because historically, that's where things sort of flattened in points per game. Those were the players who were giving you an edge in fantasy football. Now, what I found was that the vast majority of wide receiver league winners were drafted in the first 5 rounds of 12-team league drafts. 89% of wide receiver league winners were drafted in the first 5 rounds. That was 73% for running back. And when you look at that from the perspective of hit rate, so you're saying, here's how many wide receivers were drafted in this round, and here's how many wide receivers gave you a league-winning season, early round wide receivers win again. When you get to round 6 or so, your odds of hitting on a league-winning wide receiver plummets. Round 7, it really plummets. At running back, your odds of finding a league-winning running back in round 8, is better than a wide receiver in round 6. Now, what the study didn't talk about was the exact edge that you're gaining at either position by having one of those league winners. It's been proven that uber elite running backs are generally the ones giving you the biggest advantage in fantasy football. That's a huge reason, along with the hit rates of running backs in the first, second, and third rounds, that's a big reason I'll start my drafts with a running back or two. But if you're truly going 0 wide receiver, depending on how people are defining it, that means that you're not taking a wide receiver for at least the first 4 or 5 rounds of your draft. And then you have to ask, what's the alternative? If you're not going wide receiver there, what position are you getting? And the alternative in that scenario is that you're getting a running back or a tight end, maybe a quarterback. The problem is that we know quarterbacks don't hold much value and generally aren't worthwhile that early. At tight end, we know that middle round and non-elite tight ends have been pretty worthless in fantasy football through the years. And then with running backs, there's a legitimate dead zone at the position when you get to rounds 4 and 5. Those 2 rounds are usually not a very good place to bet on the running back position. And based on the league winner data, it's better to go wide receiver at that point in the draft than it is to go running back. So I'm not really a believer in a 0 wide receiver approach. And I'd agree with what you're saying in this question. The strategy often seems like it's being built on how your team looks post-draft as opposed to how usable that team is. On paper, your team will look great if you go more 0 wide receiver, but it's not as usable as you think. Because the wide receivers that you're starting, if you go more 0 wide receiver, they're not going to finish as well as you probably think. That's at least what history's taught us. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Hope you enjoy your weekend, and I will talk to you next week.